Hey Bookaholics, so welcome back to another video. Today I am bringing you a cozy September wrap-up. I am in the Mediterranean, so it's actually quite warm. So I'm here in a jumper for questionable reasons and I have a hot beverage. But we're going to make this as cozy as possible and I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in September. I do have dedicated reading vlogs to the majority of these, so I won't bore you too much. I can kind of reference you to if you want longer winded thoughts about these elsewhere. So the first vlog that I did for this month was I wanted to read like I was a dark academia student, and for that I made a criteria of reading a classic, a non-fiction and a literary book, and then I wanted them all to have like a darker theme because of dark academia adjacent. The first one of those was Night and Day by Virginia Woolf, which is a classic that follows four characters. We have Kathy, Mary, Ralph and William. Kathy is a mathematician who has grown up in a literary family, so she has to hide her abilities. Mary is a poet and a suffragette. We have Ralph, who believes that marriage should be between equals, and we have William, who will accept nothing but unwavering devotion and therefore submission from his wife. So it's a social commentary of the time. I think I understand what Virginia Woolf was trying to do with this book, but it didn't work for me. I liked Mrs. Dalloway by this author. I was excited to be getting into this one, and it just didn't quite work for me. There wasn't enough discussion for me. The way that the society was created made it very difficult to place in time, because when all of the the atmosphere and the vibes are very much one era, but then there should have been mentions of things like a war, there should have been other social things like historically going on that would have been too prevalent to just not be mentioned in a book set in that time frame. So I don't really know when it's set. I don't fully think that she went into enough discussion about some of the things that were touched upon, and I understand that might also be a product of its time. She was a woman writing in this time, so I don't know if it would have been even potentially dangerous for her to discuss even further, but it didn't quite work for me, which is a shame. I'm still excited to read more of her works, but this one just didn't quite land. The non-fiction I read was The Five by Hallie Rumenhold, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper, and it's exactly what it says on the tin. This is as much information as we possibly have of the 5 victims of notorious Victorian serial killer Jack the Ripper, and this one is it's fantastic, the way that it goes into the lives of these women. I said in the vlog, and I'll say it again, I think that it is really important that we have books like this that focus on the victims. We have, as a society, created a almost celebrity culture around criminals, especially murderers, and I think that it kind of stems back to this time period, the mystification of Jack the Ripper and then him garnering this level of notoriety. I think that instead, having a book that is focused on the victims and the lives that were taken, what their circumstances were, demystifying some of the falsehoods that were said about these women, about them being prostitutes, to try and brush off the severity of the crime, to try and minimize the panic that would have ensued. I just think that this book did a really good job of making real people discussing the lives of these women and therefore highlighting the tragedy as opposed to just the eerie intrigue of a criminal. It's the tragedy of what happened to these women, not just their murder but their life's circumstances. Would highly recommend. If you're not normally a non-fiction person, this isn't a non-fiction that's necessarily going to turn you, but if this is a topic that you are interested in, or if you're looking to read more non-fiction, especially historical non-fiction, I would highly recommend. And the last one for this vlog that I read was The Medusa Amulet, which is by Robert Marcello, and this is a literary thriller that is about the Medusa Amulet, which is a amulet that was created in the 1500s. It's said that it can give eternal life. This amulet then gets lost throughout history. Then enter David. Now, David's sister is dying and he has run out of funds to help her with her medical bills because it's America and yay for America's health system. And so he then gets offered $1 million to go and find this amulet, as he is an art historian. So then he traces its whereabouts throughout history, from the French Revolution all the way through to the Nazi Party, and it's how he goes about finding this amulet. And I enjoyed this. I actually had a really good time with it. It's not necessarily one that I am going to be like, oh, I want to read everything this author wrote. Like, it's not that the writing style was like, oh my god, new favorite author. It was just like, this was a good story and I had a good time with it. Now, if this author put out another book that had a premise that I found interesting, I would consider reading it. However, I think that it was more the premise of this book than the actual writing that got me into it. And I had a really good time. It had a level of pretentiousness. You know, we have people going to Oxford, going to museums, etc. So we had that level of pretension that suited the dark academia vibes really well. And it had like a Da Vinci Code-esque, you know, historical symbology, or in this case, a historical medallion being the center of a modern day mystery. And I enjoyed it. The second vlog was reading dark academia books. You know, after I've pretended to be a dark academia student, I might as well read some dark academia. And the first book that I read for that vlog was A Lesson in Vengeance by Victoria Lee. This one is a YA dark academia that follows Felicity, and Felicity has just returned to Dalloway House, which is a prestigious school that she attends, and she had taken a year off because her girlfriend had tragically died and then she had a breakdown. All of this is surrounding the fact that in Dalloway House there is the legend that there were 5 witches who were murdered there hundreds of years ago. Enter new girl Ellis. Now Ellis is writing a novel about the 5 witches that are rumoured to haunt Dalloway House, and Felicity knows that you should never dabble with those witches because of what happened to her girlfriend. However, she ends up getting roped in anyway with Ellis's new novel. Together they start uncovering more than they potentially should. I really liked this book until the ending. The ending I did not like at all, because it undermined a lot of the things that the book was trying to establish. A lot of the conversations that the book was having about literature, especially when it comes to queer women, when it comes to mental health, threw that all in the trash. And it was like, oh, okay, so you didn't actually mean all the things that you were discussing. That's a shame. So the atmosphere was great, the setup was great. I wanted more of the witchy stuff than we got, and it did kind of for a while feel like it was gonna head that way, and then it didn't. So there were things that disappointed me, but there were a lot of things to love as well. So I have mixed feelings about it. 3 stars. The next dark academia that I read was, of course, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This one is an adult standalone that follows a young man named Richard who comes from a modest family in California, but he wants more from his life than his humdrum small town. So he enrolls in this very small, very elite university in, I think it's Vermont is where it's set. And while he is there, he gets accepted into this very elite, very specifically small society that is hosted by this Greek classics professor. And the group then begin experimenting with ideals and philosophies that then become less and less moral as the story goes on. It has some discussions in here. I don't think that the discussions or themes went as far as I would like them to. It did have fantastic vibes, the dark academia vibes, this university campus, the classics element to it, the parallels that it draws to some other pieces of literature, the way that it philosophizes things. Very fascinating, but not for me an enjoyable read. Like, it's not one that I actually cared about particularly. It's one of those that it's more to be admired than loved, and that's fine. It just wasn't my jam. I understand why people would like it, but it didn't do it for me. I ended up giving it 3 stars. The last one for the Dark Academia vlog that I read was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a dystopian Dark Academia. It is set mostly at Hailsham School, and it is narrated by Kathy, who is now in her 30s, but she's reminiscing on her times at Hailsham, which was this very fancy school that had a lot of focus on art and on education, only for her and her friends to have to face the reality of their lives and of their circumstances. So we have Kathy reminiscing on being at Hailsham did or didn't prepare her for in life. I don't want to talk too much about it because this one's very easy to spoil. I absolutely loved this book. This was my favorite of the 3. I gave it 4.5, and it's very grim. It's when you think of things that are miserable in American versus miserable in English, just English miserable to me seems so much more miserable, and this is English miserable. Like, it's very miserable. It's just grim and miserable. That's all there is to it. But I had such a good time with it. Now, Kathy is a character that takes a while to get used to because she is telling it with almost this clinical removal. But it is from the lens of someone who is trying very hard to process their trauma, and it's in a very interesting way. So personally, I really liked this. I think that it's underrated when it comes to dark academia. It doesn't necessarily give the same pretentious vibes or the same elitist vibes, but it does have dark themes and it discusses them in a very grim way. And on top of that, it does have an educational setting, and the school does feel very pretentious and elitist. So it does have the elements. It's not a traditional style dark academia, but if you are looking for academia with dark themes, then you can't really go wrong with this one. And the last thing that I have to talk about is I read the entire Lady Trent, or Memoirs of Lady Trent series by Marie Brennan, including the companion novel. This series consists of A Natural History of Dragons, The Tropic of Serpents, Voyage of the Basilisk, The Labyrinth of Drakes, Within the Sanctuary of Wings, and the companion novel Turning Darkness into Light. The main core series is about Lady Trent. Lady Trent is now a renowned naturalist in dragons. She is one of the leading experts in dragons. However, this story is how she got to be this person, because once she was a young woman whose love of education and learning, and especially dragons, outweighed social norms of the time. How she broke the mold, how she came to be the woman that she is. And in this story, we are following her. In the first one, it's her first encounter with writing about dragons and discovering dragons, etc. So this was an absolutely fantastic series. The discussions in the book are absolutely incredible, especially because it's set in different parts of this fictional world, which is very much based on our world. It's basically Victorian times in a fictional world. So we have things like colonialism, we have an African style setting, we have a Eastern European style setting, we have an Arabic style setting, and all of the social discussions about the time. We have things like gender, we have things to do with heterosexuality versus homosexuality, we have race as a huge factor, we have colonialism. So many important discussions in this series, all while it's focusing on dragons. The dragons are not the main part. If you're reading this because you want just people flying on dragons, then you know this is an Aragon. That's not what you're going to get. This is a story that is about the societies and about the study of dragons. So if you're going into this wanting dragon fiction in a traditional sense, this is not for you. But if you want the academia, if you want what a woman studying in Victorian era would be like. Later on, you have a character who is clearly Islamic studying amongst white people. You have different cultures and heritages and their approach, in this case, to dragons. So many cultures and societies were addressed in this series in such a fascinating way, and it was a brilliant way to have conversations about our past and about our present through fantasy. I loved this series. I would highly recommend you check it out. 5 stars across the board. Fantastic series. The companion novel follows Audrey, who is Isabella Trent, so Lady Trent's granddaughter, and it is following her as she wants to become a researcher herself. And this is things like, it's not ancestral trauma because there's no trauma, it's how legacies work, how living up to your family's expectations or the world's expectations of you based on who your family are. It has a lot of discussions. There's a lot of mixed media in here. We have newspaper clippings, we have letters, we have a very epistolary vibe to it, although it's not entirely written in letters. You have diary entries, etc. And I just think that the way this book continued what had been established in Lady Trent, and it gives you leave to have an even bigger time jump. You know, Lady Trent at this point is really old, so this is more of like a World War II feel. In my opinion, you have an almost mystery element to it as well. And it was just a fantastic way to kind of give us a glimpse into where this world has gone since the main series ended, which I think was really nice. Do I think this needs to be a series in its own right? I don't, but it was good and I had a good time. But there you have it. Those are all the books that I read in September. I'm happy with how much I did manage to read. I was having a lot of migraines, so I didn't manage to read anything digitally. My book that I had reserved for this month, my standalone, Orquídea Divina, I ended up reading in October. It is read. I read it on the 1st of October. So it still got read. It just got read a day late, essentially. But yeah, I had a really good reading month when it comes to quality for the most part. It's just the quantity wasn't what I was hoping. I made myself a massive TBR and I didn't get around to it, and that's okay. Like, it's fine. That's where I'm at the moment. I'm glad that I managed to read anything, to be honest, because I was having such a terrible time in September at some various points. I started back at work, the kids start back at work, my husband started a new job. Just so much was going on that I didn't read anywhere near as much as I would have liked for the beginning of autumn. At least I got some stuff read, and I'm happy with that. But that is all for me for today. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you liked this video. I will hopefully catch you in another one soon. Bye.